Arthur Vance lived in a world of sharp edges and cold glass. His office, situated on the 90th floor of the Vance Tower, was a monument to clinical perfection. There were no family photos on his desk, no colorful mementos of vacations taken, and certainly no dust. At 45, Arthur had reached the pinnacle of global commerce, but his soul felt like a desert. He was known in the tabloids as the Glacial King, a man who could bankrupt a competitor over a morning espresso without a flicker of regret. To Arthur, people were nothing more than biological machines driven by predictable greeds and flawed emotions. He hated the unpredictability of human connection. His daily routine was a clockwork nightmare of efficiency. He woke at 4 a.m., exercised in a gym that overlooked the sleeping city, and began his first international briefings before the sun touched the horizon. He preferred the silence of his 10,000-square-foot penthouse. It was a cathedral of marble and chrome where the only heartbeat was his own. He often told his reflection that he didn't hate people, he simply found them inefficient. They were loud, they were messy, and they constantly wanted things they hadn't earned. On this particular Tuesday, a merger had just been finalized. His net worth had increased by hundreds of millions, yet as he stood by his floor-to-ceiling windows, he felt a strange, hollow ache. The city below looked like a motherboard, and the people were just tiny pulses of light. For the first time in 20 years, the silence of his office didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a tomb. He looked at his hands, clean, manicured, and powerful, and realized he couldn't remember the last time he had felt the warmth of another person's skin in a simple handshake that wasn't a business transaction. He was the most powerful man in the room, and he was utterly, coldly alone. The Iron Emperor was sitting on a throne of ice, and it was finally starting to feel cold. He grabbed his tailored overcoat, ignored his ringing phone, and did something he never did. He took the elevator down to the street level, leaving his security detail behind. As the elevator descended, Arthur felt a tightening in his chest. The lobby of his building was a masterpiece of granite, usually teeming with sycophants waiting for a nod from him. He slipped out of a side entrance, stepping onto the sidewalk like a ghost. The evening air was thick with the smell of roasted nuts, exhaust fumes, and the humid breath of a million strangers. It was overwhelming. To Arthur, the real world was a place he viewed through tinted limousine windows. Being physically immersed in it felt like stepping into a cold lake. He began to walk, his expensive leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the pavement. He passed a flower shop where a young man was frantically picking out a bouquet, looking at his watch with a mixture of terror and excitement. Arthur watched him with a clinical detachment. Love, he thought, is just a chemical imbalance leading to poor financial decisions. He passed a diner where a family was laughing over a shared plate of fries, a child's face smeared with ketchup. He recoiled slightly at the sight. It was all so chaotic. He found himself wandering toward a residential district where the skyscrapers gave way to brownstones and small, flickering street lamps. The silence here was different from the silence of his penthouse. It wasn't the silence of isolation, it was the quiet of a day winding down. He saw shadows of people behind curtains, living lives that revolved around grocery lists and school plays. He felt a stinging sense of alienation. He had spent his entire life building a wall of money to keep the world out, only to find it too high to see over. He sat down on a park bench, his $5,000 suit pressing against the rough wood. He looked at his reflection in a nearby puddle. He saw a man who had everything and possessed nothing. He had optimized his life for success, but had deleted the joy. He wondered if he had stayed in the office too long, not just today, but for the last 2 decades. Just as he was about to stand up and call for his car to take him back to his sterile sanctuary, a flash of bright neon pink caught the corner of his eye. It was a color that didn't belong in his monochromatic world. The pink object was a backpack, shaped like a triceratops with glittery horns. It was strapped to the back of a very small girl, who was currently marching down the sidewalk with the grim determination of a soldier headed to the front lines. Arthur watched her, mesmerized by her lack of hesitation. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her pigtails were lopsided, one ribbon trailing behind her like a fallen banner. She stopped a few feet from his bench, huffed a great sigh of exhaustion, and adjusted the heavy straps of her bag. Arthur froze. His internal people management software crashed. He knew how to talk to prime ministers. He knew how to intimidate hedge fund managers to silence. But a child? A child was a wild variable. They didn't follow the rules of logic or leverage. He hoped she would just keep walking, but the universe had other plans. The girl turned, her large, dark eyes locking onto his. There was no fear in her gaze, only a profound, weary curiosity. She walked toward him, her small sneakers squeaking on the pavement. Arthur felt a bead of sweat form at his temple. He straightened his tie, a reflex from 1,000 boardrooms. He tried to look busy, staring intently at his darkened phone screen, but she didn't care about his status. She stopped right in front of his knees, her backpack nearly as big as she was. Up close, she could see she had been crying. There were saltish streaks on her cheeks, and her nose was a dusty rose color. Yet she held her head high. She looked at his crisp white shirt, his polished cufflinks, and the way he sat with such rigid, painful posture. To her, she didn't look like a CEO. She looked like a fellow traveler. "You're very dressed up for being out here," she observed, her voice high and steady. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound feeling loud in the quiet street. I was just walking," he managed to say. His voice, usually a booming instrument of authority, sounded thin and uncertain. The girl nodded solemnly, as if she understood a secret he hadn't shared. She climbed onto the bench next to him, her small legs dangling, not even reaching the edge of the seat. She looked at the darkening sky and then back at him. "Did you run away from home, too?" she asked innocently. The question hit Arthur like a physical blow. Run away? He was a man of industry, a titan of the economy. He didn't run away. He took strategic leaves or corporate retreats. But as he looked at the little girl, he realized the terrifying truth of her words. He had walked out of his office, ignored his staff, and sought the anonymity of the streets because he couldn't stand the person he had become inside those glass walls. He said, "I'm Arthur." He avoided the question. It was the first time he had introduced himself without his last name in years. "I'm Lily," she replied. She reached into the side pocket of her dinosaur bag and pulled out a crumpled tissue, wiping her nose with a loud honk. "I've been walking for a really long time, maybe 100 miles. My legs feel like noodles." Arthur looked at the street sign. They were barely 3 blocks from the residential district she likely lived in. To him, it was a minute's walk. To her, it was an epic journey across a continent. "Why did you run away, Lily? It's getting dark. The world isn't very kind after the sun goes down." Lily's face crumpled for a second before the anger returned. "Because of Chloe and the blue juice." Arthur blinked. He tried to process this information. Was Chloe a rival? A hostile takeover? Who is Chloe? "She's a girl from my school. My mommy was babysitting her because Chloe's mommy had to work late. Chloe is mean. She says my drawings look like spaghetti. And then, Lily's voice hitched. Mommy gave her the blue juice box, the last one, the one with the straw that bends. Mommy knows that's my favorite. If she gave it to Chloe, it means she likes Chloe better. So I packed my stuff and left. I'm going to live in the library now. I heard they have beanbags there." Arthur felt a strange sensation in his chest, a mix of amusement and a sharp, sudden pity. He saw the logic of a child. A juice box wasn't just a drink. It was a symbol of rank, of love, and of belonging. He looked at this tiny, fierce person who had abandoned everything over a straw that bends, and for the first time in a decade, the Iron Emperor felt his heart begin to thaw. Arthur sat in stunned silence, processing the blue juice box betrayal. In his world, betrayal involved insider trading or intellectual property theft. But looking at Lily, he realized that the stakes of the human heart don't scale with age. To this 6-year-old, the loss of that blue juice box was a total collapse of her social contract. It was a sign that her primary shareholder, her mother, had liquidated her stock in favor of a competitor named Chloe. "A straw that bends is a significant asset," Arthur said, his voice regaining a bit of his boardroom gravity, though now it was tinged with a dry, unexpected humor. "However, Lily, have you considered the logistics of living in a library? The overhead is low, yes, but the snack options are notoriously limited, and the no-talking rule would be a difficult merger for someone as talkative as you." Lily looked at him, her brow furrowed in deep thought. "I can whisper. I'm very good at whispering when I'm hiding from the monsters under my bed." She paused, her eyes scanning Arthur's expensive silk tie. "Are you a king? You talk like the man in my storybook who owns all the mountains." Arthur let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "I don't own mountains, Lily. I own buildings and companies. But sitting here with you, I feel like I might be less prepared for the real world than you are." He looked down at his phone. It was vibrating, his head of security, no doubt. Usually he would bark an order and hang up. Now he felt a strange hesitation. If he called his world back into this moment, the magic of this bench would vanish. "Your mother," Arthur began, leaning forward slightly, "she didn't give Chloe the juice because she loves her more. In business, we call that resource management. Perhaps she thought you were strong enough to handle the red juice while Chloe was too weak. She wasn't rewarding Chloe, she was relying on you." Lily's eyes widened. This was a perspective she hadn't considered. She looked at her dinosaur backpack, her grip on the straps loosening. "You think I'm the strong one? Only a very strong person walks 100 miles over a juice box," Arthur said solemnly. Encouraged by Arthur's business analysis, Lily began to open up further. She didn't just talk, she narrated her life with the vivid intensity of a documentary filmmaker. She told him about her mother, Sarah, who smelled like vanilla and tiredness. She described their small apartment, where the radiator hissed like a grumpy dragon, and the window looked out over a bakery that made the air smell like sugar every morning at 5 a.m. Arthur listened, truly listened, for the first time in years. He learned that Sarah worked at a dry cleaner's during the day and took sewing commissions at night. He learned that Lily's father was a ghost in a photograph who had left before she was born. As Lily spoke, Arthur began to construct a mental map of a life that was the polar opposite of his own. His life was filled with marble, silence, and excess. Hers was filled with cramped spaces, noise, and a desperate, beautiful struggle. "Mommy cries sometimes," Lily whispered, kicking her feet against the bench. "She thinks I'm asleep, but I'm not. She cries over the blue papers that come in the mail. I think the blue papers are mean. That's why I was so mad about the juice. I thought, maybe she's crying because of me." Arthur felt a sharp, cold pang in his chest. He knew what those blue papers were: utility shutoff notices, final demands, the mean papers of the adult world. He looked at this child who was carrying the emotional weight of her mother's poverty on her tiny shoulders. He realized that Lily hadn't just run away because of a juice box. She had run away because the tension in her home was becoming a weight she couldn't carry. She thought she was the problem. "Lily," Arthur said, his voice softer than it had ever been in a negotiation, "the papers aren't your fault, and I suspect your mother isn't crying because of you. She's likely crying because she wants to give you the moon, but she can only afford the stars." Lily looked up at him, a tiny smile breaking through her sadness. "The stars are better anyway. You can't fit the moon in a backpack." The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the streetlights flickered to life, casting long amber shadows across the pavement. The reality of the situation began to settle on Arthur. A 6-year-old girl was missing, and he was sitting on a park bench with her while her mother was likely experiencing the worst nightmare a parent could endure. He stood up, his height making him look like a giant next to the small girl. "Lily, we need to find your mother, not because you're in trouble, but because she is currently losing her heart thinking you're gone." Lily looked scared for a moment, her lower lip trembling. "Will she be mad?" "She will be many things," Arthur said, pulling his phone from his pocket. "Relieved, exhausted, perhaps a bit loud, but she won't be mad that you're safe." He didn't call the police first. He called Marcus, his head of global security, a man who had formerly worked for intelligence agencies. Marcus answered on the first ring. "Sir, we've been tracking your phone. You're in a high-crime district. We have a team 2 minutes away." "Stand down, Marcus," Arthur commanded, his CEO voice returning. "I don't need extraction. I need information. Find a woman named Sarah Jenkins. She likely lives within 5 blocks of my current GPS. She has a daughter named Lily. Find her contact information and her current location immediately. And Marcus, do it quietly. No sirens, no drama." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Marcus had never heard Arthur Vance sound concerned. "Understood, sir. Give me 60 seconds." Arthur looked down at Lily. She was watching him with wide eyes. "Who are you talking to? Is it a wizard?" "In a way," Arthur replied, watching the digital map pulse on his phone. "He's a man who finds things that are lost, and right now he's finding your mommy." The 60 seconds felt like 60 minutes. Arthur paced the small patch of sidewalk in front of the bench, while Lily occupied herself by arranging pebbles in a circle. The contrast was stark, the billionaire agitated by a ticking clock, and the runaway child finding peace in the dirt. His phone buzzed. A dossier appeared on his screen. Sarah Jenkins, 28 years old, address 412 Maple Street, Apt 3B, employment, Sunrise Dry Cleaners, no criminal record, multiple overdue notices from Southside Power and Light. There was a photo of her from a state ID. She had the same defiant spark in her eyes as Lily, but her face was etched with exhaustion from someone who hadn't slept in years. "I found her," Arthur whispered. "Is she at home?" Lily asked, standing up and hoisting her heavy backpack. Marcus, where is she now?" Arthur asked into his earpiece. "Sir, she's currently 4 blocks from you. She's running door to door. She looks highly distressed. We've sighted her on a street-level camera. She's heading toward the park." Arthur looked toward the end of the street. In the distance, he saw a figure. A woman was running, her coat flapping open, her hair a wild mess. She was stopping every person she saw, gesturing wildly, her voice carrying on the wind, a desperate, jagged sound that cut through the evening air. "Lily," Arthur said, pointing toward the figure. "Is that her?" Lily squinted through the darkness. The woman turned under a streetlight, her face illuminated for a brief second. "Mommy!" Lily screamed. It wasn't a cry of fear, it was a roar of recognition. She didn't wait for Arthur. She bolted, her dinosaur backpack bouncing wildly against her back, her small sneakers pounding the pavement with a speed that startled him. Arthur watched her go, a strange feeling of emptiness suddenly filling the space where the little girl had just been. He followed at a slower pace, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that no billion-dollar deal had ever managed to achieve. He was about to witness a world he didn't understand, the world of unconditional love. The collision between mother and daughter was more than a physical hug. It was a violent release of terror. Sarah Jenkins collapsed to her knees on the cold concrete just as Lily slammed into her. The dinosaur backpack hit the ground with a heavy thud, forgotten. Sarah's cries were jagged and raw, the sound of a woman who had just stared into the abyss and seen her world return. She checked Lily's face, her arms, her hands, as if memorizing her daughter's existence all over again. "I'm sorry about the juice, Mommy. I'm sorry I ran to the library." Sarah didn't care about the juice. She didn't care about the miles Lily had walked. She simply held her. After a few minutes, Sarah's eyes drifted upward, catching the silhouette of the tall, imposing man standing nearby. She stiffened. She saw the tailored wool coat, the glint of a watch that cost more than her apartment, and the stern, frozen expression on Arthur's face. To a woman living on the edge of survival, a man like Arthur usually represented a threat, a landlord, a lawyer, or a debt collector. "Who are you?" she gasped, pulling Lily closer, her protective instincts flaring. Did you find her?" Arthur cleared his throat, feeling a sudden, inexplicable bashfulness. "My name is Arthur Vance. I found her on the bench back there. She was explaining her grievances regarding a juice box." He tried to sound professional, but his voice lacked its usual icy edge. He saw Sarah's eyes widen at his name. She lived in the city. She knew the names on the skyscrapers. She wasn't looking at a savior. She was looking at a legend, and she was terrified. Sarah stood up slowly, keeping Lily's hand locked in hers. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to reclaim some shred of dignity. "Arthur Vance? The CEO?" She looked at her own clothes, an old stained hoodie and sneakers with holes in the toes. The disparity between them was a chasm. "Why would you stay with her? Why didn't you just call the police?" "Lily is quite persuasive," Arthur replied. His eyes drifted to the little girl who was now hiding behind her mother's leg. "She informed me that she was living in the library now. I felt it was my duty to inform her that the library doesn't serve snacks." Sarah let out a weak, hysterical laugh. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a crushing exhaustion. Arthur noticed the way her shoulders slumped. He looked at her hands. They were red and chapped, the hands of someone who worked in harsh chemicals and spent her nights sewing to make ends meet. He saw the blue papers Lily had mentioned earlier, crumpled in Sarah's pocket. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I can't give you anything for this. I don't have money for a reward." Arthur felt a flare of irritation, not at her, but at the world that made her think he would want her money. "I don't want your money, Miss Jenkins. I have more than enough of my own." He paused, looking at the dark street and the tiny, shivering child. "You're blocks away from your home, and it's freezing. My car is around the corner. Let me at least see you home safely." Sarah hesitated. Every instinct told her not to get into a car with a stranger, even a famous one. But she looked at Lily, who was yawning so hard her eyes watered, and then at the dark, dangerous walk ahead of them. "Okay," she whispered, "just to the corner of Maple Street." The interior of Arthur's Maybach was a sensory shock for Sarah and Lily. It smelled of expensive leather and silence. Lily immediately began poking the glowing buttons on the door panel until Arthur, with a rare, ghost-like smile, showed her how to change the ambient lighting to pink. As the car glided silently through the city, Arthur watched Sarah in the reflection of the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window, her face pale. She wasn't impressed by the luxury. She looked burdened by it. It reminded her of everything she didn't have. "Lily tells me you work at the dry cleaners," Arthur said, breaking the silence. "And I sew. I make alterations. I'm a good worker. It was a mistake. I shouldn't have let that girl Chloe over, but I needed the extra $20 her mom offered to watch Chloe." Arthur looked at the dashboard. $20. He spent more than that on his daily bottle of imported mineral water. The realization was a physical weight in his stomach. He thought about his boardroom battles, his crises involving stock dips of 0.5%. They were games. This woman was fighting a war every single day just to keep a dinosaur backpack filled with glitter crayons. They pulled up to 412 Maple Street. The building was a crumbling brick structure with a flickering light in the hallway and a pile of trash bags by the door. It was a place Arthur wouldn't even visit for a real estate appraisal. "We're here," Sarah said, unbuckling Lily. "Thank you again, Mr. Vance. Truly, you saved my life tonight." As they climbed out, Arthur saw a man standing by the front door, a burly man holding a clipboard. He saw Sarah freeze. "Mr. Henderson, please, I told you, I'll have the rest by Friday. I just had a family emergency." "Friday was 3 days ago, Sarah," he said, not unkindly, but firmly. "The owner says the locks go on tomorrow morning." Arthur stepped out of the car, the heavy door closing with a solid, expensive thud that silenced the street. Arthur Vance didn't negotiate with building managers. He commanded. He walked up to the man with the clipboard, his presence so sudden and overwhelming that the man actually stepped back. "What is the outstanding balance for this unit?" Arthur asked, his voice like a gavel hitting a block. "I... Who are you?" the manager stuttered. "The man who is about to make your life very difficult if you don't answer the question." He didn't wait for an answer. He pulled a gold clip from his pocket, peeled off $500 bills, and handed them to the man. "This covers the arrears and the next 3 months. I want a receipt emailed to Miss Jenkins tonight. If I hear her name again in a negative context, I will buy this building and fire you personally." The manager vanished into the building without a word. Sarah stood on the sidewalk, trembling. "Why did you do that? I can't pay you back. I told you I can't." "You're right, you can't," Arthur interrupted, turning to her. He looked at Lily, who had fallen asleep standing up, her head leaning against her mother's hip. "Miss Jenkins, I live in a house with 22 rooms. I have a staff that fears me, and a life that is remarkably empty. I find myself in need of a household manager, someone who understands the importance of resource management and juice boxes." Sarah stared at him, her mouth open. "You're offering me a job? Because I'm poor?" "I'm offering you a job because your daughter is the only person in this city who has had the courage to tell me I look like I'm hiding," Arthur said, his voice cracking for the briefest second. "The pay is 6 figures. The guest wing is yours. You will manage my estate, my schedule, and you will ensure that no one, including me, forgets what it's like to be human. Do you accept, or do you prefer the library?" Sarah looked at the dark, crumbling apartment building, then at the sleeping child in her arms, and finally at the lonely billionaire. She took a deep breath. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow. Bring the dinosaur backpack." The next morning, the Maybach, now carrying a much more anxious cargo, glided back towards Arthur's penthouse. Sarah clutched Lily's hand, her heart a tangled knot of fear and bewildering hope. The sheer audacity of Arthur's offer, the abruptness of this life upheaval, felt like a dream she was afraid to wake from. Lily, still groggy, was more excited about the prospect of a very big house and was already planning where her dinosaurs would live. As they ascended into the sky, the city spread out beneath them like a glittering, indifferent jewel. Sarah had only ever seen Arthur Vance's tower from the ground, a distant, imposing spire. Now she was going inside. The lobby of the Vance Global building was a spectacle of polished marble and hushed tones, overseen by security guards who looked like they could break rocks with their bare hands. Arthur, walking ahead, seemed to glide through this environment, an apex predator in his natural habitat. Sarah, pushing a small suitcase and holding Lily, felt like a nervous rabbit caught in a spotlight. Upon reaching the penthouse, the doors whispered open to reveal a space that took Sarah's breath away. It wasn't a home, it was an art gallery, a minimalist museum of expensive, stark beauty. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city. The furniture was sculptural, the floors gleamed, and the air was scentless, sterile. There wasn't a single personal touch, no warmth, no clutter, no life. Lily, however, immediately spotted the vast, empty expanse of the living room. "It's a giant racetrack for my cars!" she shrieked, letting go of Sarah's hand and running a few delighted circles on the pristine floor. Arthur watched, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He had designed his home to be impervious to chaos, a fortress against the world. Now, a small child's laughter echoed off the marble walls, and the subtle scent of Lily's strawberry shampoo was beginning to mingle with the recycled air. Sarah, meanwhile, was trying to quickly clean up the imaginary dirt Lily's shoes were surely leaving behind, her instincts as a caregiver instantly kicking in. This was not just a job, it was an invasion, and she was the reluctant general. Arthur led them to the guest wing, a sprawling set of rooms that, to Sarah, felt larger than her entire previous apartment. It included a spacious bedroom, a private sitting area, and a bathroom that boasted a shower with 6 different jets. Lily immediately declared the sitting area Dinosaur Kingdom and began to unpack her meager collection of plastic prehistoric creatures onto a polished side table. "Your duties, Miss Jenkins," Arthur began, his voice resuming his corporate cadence, "will involve managing the household staff, the cleaning crew, the chef, the maintenance teams. You will oversee all provisions, schedules, and ensure the smooth operation of the estate. I expect efficiency and discretion. My personal schedule will be provided to you daily." He handed her a tablet already loaded with complex calendars and security protocols. Sarah, still reeling, nodded. "Understood, Mr. Vance. I'm used to cleaning toilets and folding dry cleaning, not managing an empire. This was a quantum leap in responsibility. And one more thing," Arthur added, his gaze softening slightly as he looked at Lily, who was now having a fierce whispered debate between a T-Rex and a Stegosaurus. "You are to ensure that the environment here is suitable for Lily. She is to have everything she needs within reason." He saw the eviction notice peeking out of Sarah's purse, a stark reminder of her recent struggles. His offer wasn't just about getting a house manager. It was about giving Lily a stable foundation. He then pulled out a contract, thick, leather-bound, and intimidating. Sarah felt a wave of nausea. She'd never signed anything more complex than a phone bill. But the salary listed on it was more than she could have imagined in a lifetime of dry cleaning. It was enough to wipe out all her debts, provide for Lily, and give them a security she'd only ever dreamed of. It was life-changing. "You don't have to read it all now," Arthur said, noticing her pale face. "My legal team will go over it with you tomorrow, but rest assured it's a standard employment contract. There are no hidden clauses about selling your soul." He almost smiled, a brief, fleeting curve of his lips. "Consider it a long-term investment in emotional intelligence for my household." The first few days were a blur of culture shock for Sarah and Lily, and a seismic disruption for Arthur. Lily, with her boundless energy and uninhibited curiosity, treated the penthouse like an elaborate playground. She discovered the hidden pantry filled with exotic snacks, used the vast hallways for impromptu races, and tried to teach Arthur's stoic security guards how to play tag. Sarah, meanwhile, was overwhelmed. The household staff, a team of impeccably trained professionals, viewed her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. She, a woman who used to hand-wash delicates, was now directing a chef about menu planning and overseeing a team of cleaners. Her greatest challenge, however, was Arthur himself. He was a creature of habit, and Lily was a wrecking ball to routine. One morning, Arthur came down to find Lily finger painting on a large easel that Sarah had somehow conjured into existence in the minimalist living room. He stopped dead in his tracks. His pristine floors were protected by a large canvas tarp, but the very idea of paint in his domain was an affront to his sensibilities. Sarah, however, looked at him with a quiet defiance. "She needs to express herself, Mr. Vance," Sarah explained, her voice firm. "I've taped off the perimeter. No paint will touch your walls." Arthur just stared at the vibrant colors on the canvas, a riot of purples and greens that clashed magnificently with his muted decor. He felt a strange tightening in his chest, not anger, but a profound unfamiliarity. This was what living looked like. He had designed a perfect, sterile environment, and Lily was painting life all over it. The penthouse was slowly, reluctantly transforming. There was now a faint smell of crayons in the air, a small, brightly colored stuffed animal occasionally left on a sofa, and the distant sound of childish giggles echoing through halls that had been silent for years. The fortress was being breached, one juice box, one dinosaur, and one determined little girl at a time. Arthur, ever the strategist, attempted to impose order on the beautiful chaos that had descended upon the penthouse. He drafted a set of household regulations. It was a precise 3-page document printed on heavy stock paper, detailing everything from quiet hours, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., to approved zones for play-based activities, guest wing only. He presented it to Sarah with the gravity of a corporate merger agreement. Sarah read it, her lips twitching with amusement. Lily, sitting on the counter and swinging her legs, looked at the document with suspicion. "Is that a menu, Mommy? Do they have chocolate milk?" "No, sweetie," Sarah said, trying to keep a straight face. "It's Mr. Arthur's rules." Arthur cleared his throat. "These are vital for the efficient operation of the household, Miss Jenkins. Structure is paramount." Later that evening, Arthur walked into his study, a room he considered his sanctum. There, perched regally on his massive oak desk, right next to his antique globe and his precise stack of financial reports, was a stuffed, one-eyed teddy bear with a faded red bow. It seemed to be staring at his computer screen with an air of profound judgment. Arthur stared back at it, feeling a bizarre sense of challenge. He had expressly forbidden non-approved personal items in common areas. This bear was a direct violation. He picked it up gingerly, as if it might explode. It felt surprisingly soft. He looked around, half expecting Lily to jump out from behind a curtain. The room was empty. He walked to the door of the guest wing, intending to return the offending item, but he paused. The sounds of Lily's laughter and Sarah's soft singing drifted from within. He held the bear for a moment longer, its one eye seeming to bore into his soul. Then he returned to his study and, with a sigh, placed the teddy bear back on his desk, carefully positioning it so it could oversee his work. The rule book was already failing, and Arthur Vance, to his own astonishment, felt a flicker of something akin to warmth. He was losing control, and for the first time in his life, it didn't entirely feel bad. Before the arrival of the Jenkins women, Arthur's breakfasts were silent, solitary affairs. He would stand at the kitchen island, scrolling through the Nikkei and FTSE 100 indices while sipping a double espresso. Food was merely fuel, a protein bar or a bowl of steel-cut oats consumed with no joy. But Sarah had changed the air in the kitchen. It now smelt of toasted cinnamon and browned butter. One Tuesday morning, Arthur walked into the kitchen to find Lily sitting on a high stool, her face partially obscured by a giant box of Galaxy Crunch cereal. Sarah was at the stove, flipping pancakes with a rhythm that suggested she had been doing this since she was Lily's age. "Good morning, Mr. Vance," Sarah said, not looking up from her pan. "I hope you don't mind, but I made an extra batch. It seemed a waste to let the batter sit." Arthur opened his mouth to mention his strict low-carb regimen, but Lily was already sliding a bowl toward him. "You have to try my special mix, Mr. Arthur. It has the little marshmallows shaped like stars. Mommy says they aren't real food, but they make your brain happy." Arthur looked at the bowl of neon-colored cereal. It was an aesthetic nightmare. However, under the expectant gaze of the child, the most powerful man in the city sat down. He took a spoonful. The sugar hit his system like a lightning bolt. "It is remarkably sweet," he managed to say. "That's the happiness working," Lily nodded. For 20 minutes, Arthur didn't check his phone once. He listened to Lily explain why the purple marshmallows tasted better than the green ones. He realized that for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't planning his day. He was simply in it. Arthur took his role as a benefactor with the same intensity he applied to a hostile takeover. He decided that the local public school, while adequate, wasn't enough for a mind as sharp as Lily's. He pulled strings that only a man of his stature could pull, securing a mid-semester spot at St. Jude's Academy, the city's most prestigious private school. On Lily's first day, Arthur insisted on being the one to walk her to the door. Sarah followed behind, dressed in a professional blazer Arthur had insisted on buying for her. Lily looked tiny in the navy blue blazer and pleated skirt of the St. Jude's uniform, but she still insisted on wearing her dinosaur backpack over the expensive wool. "Now, Lily," Arthur said, kneeling down so he was at eye level with her, a gesture that would have sent his board of directors into a state of shock. In this place, knowledge is the primary currency. You are here to learn, to grow, and to ask questions. Lily looked at the intimidating stone pillars of the school. Well, they have blue juice boxers here? Arthur smiled, a genuine, unforced expression. If they don't, I'll buy the company that makes them and have a crate delivered to your classroom by noon. He watched her march into the building, her dinosaur backpack bobbing among the sea of designer book bags. He felt a strange, fierce pride. He wasn't just providing for her, he was shielding her. As he turned to walk back to the car, he saw Sarah looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, a mix of gratitude and something much more intimate. As the weeks passed, Vance Jenkins evolved from a frantic, exhausted mother into the heart of the Vance estate. She didn't just manage the staff, she humanized them. She learned the names of the cleaners' children and the chef's favorite spices. Under her management, the penthouse stopped being a sterile museum and started being a home. She also began to observe Arthur with a keen, practiced eye. She saw the way his shoulders stayed tense until he heard Lily come home from school. She noticed that he had started leaving his office at 6 p.m. instead of midnight. She saw a man who had built a fortress to protect himself from pain, only to realize he had accidentally imprisoned himself. One evening, she found him in the library, staring at a blank wall. "You're thinking about the merger," she said softly, setting a cup of herbal tea beside him. "I'm thinking about how quiet it is when she's asleep," Arthur admitted, his voice low. "I used to crave this silence. Now it just feels like I'm waiting for the next noise." Sarah sat in the chair opposite him. "That's what family is, Arthur. It's a series of beautiful interruptions." He looked at her, really looked at her, in the soft light of the library. She wasn't just the help anymore. She was the person who knew how he took his tea and why he stared at the stars. The lines of class and employment were beginning to blur, replaced by a deep, unspoken tether. The transformation of Arthur Vance culminated on a rainy Saturday afternoon. Lily had decided that the long marble hallway leading to the master suite was the perfect bowling alley. She had lined up empty plastic water bottles as pins and was using a soft, plush ball to knock them down. "Mr. Arthur, you're the professional," Lily shouted, beckoning him over. Arthur, who was in the middle of a high-stakes conference call regarding a European acquisition, looked at the phone and then at the girl. "I'll have to call you back," he told the startled executives and hung up. He walked over, removed his suit jacket, and rolled up his sleeves. He took the plush ball from Lily. "The key, Lily, is the follow-through. You have to visualize the strike." He lunged forward, his expensive silk socks slipping on the polished marble. His feet went out under him, and he landed flat on his backside with a resounding thud. Lily froze, her eyes wide with terror, thinking she had broken the king. Then it happened. A sound erupted from Arthur's chest, a deep, resonant, and completely genuine laugh. It started as a chuckle and built into a roar. He sat there on his $1,000,000 floor, laughing at his own clumsiness. Sarah stood in the doorway, her hand over her mouth, watching in disbelief. Arthur Vance wasn't just civil, he was happy. The glacial king had finally melted. The transformation of Arthur Vance did not go unnoticed by the vultures of the corporate world. At Vance Global, the atmosphere had shifted from one of pure terror to one of quiet confusion. Arthur was no longer the first person in the building at 4 a.m. He had started taking meetings via video call from his home office, often with a colorful, hand-drawn picture of a sun visible on the wall behind him. To the board of directors, this wasn't personal growth, it was a liability. The chief antagonist was Elias Thorne, a senior board member who had been waiting for a crack in Arthur's armor for 15 years. Elias thrived on the Glacial King persona because it kept the stock prices high and the competitors terrified. At a private lunch with other shareholders, Elias leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. He's gone soft. He's moved a woman and a child into the penthouse. He's distracted. A distracted king is an invitation for a coup. They began to track Arthur's movements. They saw the school runs and the early departures. They saw a man who was trading billion-dollar leverage for bedtime stories. Rumors began to circulate in the financial press. Is Vance Global losing its edge? Has the Iron Emperor retired to a nursery? The shadow of the boardroom began to stretch toward the sunlit windows of the penthouse, threatening the fragile peace Arthur had built. The threat from the board was momentarily forgotten when a different kind of crisis struck. It began on a Tuesday evening. Lily didn't want her Galaxy Crunch. She didn't want to play with her dinosaurs. Her cheeks were flushed a deep, alarming crimson, and her eyes were glassy. Sarah pressed her hand to her forehead and gasped. Lily was burning up. By midnight, the thermometer read 103.8 degrees. Sarah was a flurry of motion, cool cloths, lukewarm baths, and whispered prayers. Arthur, hearing the commotion, appeared in the doorway of the guest wing. He had never seen a sick child before. In his world, illness was something handled by private clinics and expensive doctors in silence. Seeing Lily so small and fragile, shivering despite the heat radiating from her skin, paralyzed him. "I've called the pediatrician," Arthur said, his voice tight. "He'll be here in 20 minutes. "She's so hot, Arthur," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. She was exhausted, the old shadows of her struggling days returning to her eyes. Arthur did something he had never done. He walked over and sat on the edge of the bed. He took a cool cloth and gently wiped Lily's tiny hand. For the next 6 hours, he didn't leave. He sat in the chair by the bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest, realizing that all his billions couldn't buy a single degree of cooling for her fever. He felt a helplessness that was more terrifying than any market crash. As the sun began to peek over the skyline, the fever finally broke. Lily drifted into a deep, natural sleep. Sarah, leaning against the headboard, had also succumbed to exhaustion, her head tilted to the side. Arthur remained awake. He watched them both, the woman who had brought life into his tomb and the girl who had challenged him to stop hiding. In the quiet of the dawn, Arthur had a realization that shattered his old identity. He looked at his hands and didn't see a CEO. He saw a man who wanted to be a protector. He realized that the fortress he had built wasn't meant to keep people out. It was a prison he had built for himself because he was afraid of losing what he never had. He loved them. It wasn't a business arrangement or a resource management project. It was a family. He stood up quietly and draped a cashmere throw over Sarah. She stirred slightly, her hand brushing against his. In that brief contact, the last of Arthur's emotional walls crumbled. He knew that the board was planning to move against him. He knew Elias Thorne was sharpening his knife. But as he looked at Lily's peaceful face, he realized he didn't care about the title of CEO anymore. He only cared about being the man they thought he was. 3 days later, Arthur walked into the Vance Global boardroom. The air was thick with tension. Elias Thorne sat at the head of the table, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Arthur," Elias began, "we've called this emergency session to discuss the leadership of this company. There are concerns about your focus." The directors looked down at their tablets, avoiding Arthur's gaze. They expected the glacial king to explode, to bark orders and fire people. Instead, Arthur sat down slowly and interlaced his fingers. He looked remarkably calm. He looked like a man who had slept well because he had spent the morning eating burnt toast with a 6-year-old. "You're right, Elias," Arthur said, his voice steady and resonant. "My focus has changed. I used to think the value of this company was in its margins. I was wrong. The value of any empire is the security it provides for the people within it." He then proceeded to lay out a new vision for Vance Global, one that focused on long-term sustainability and employee welfare. Elias laughed. "This is sentimentality, not business. You've lost your edge, Arthur." Arthur leaned forward, his eyes turning into chips of flint. The king wasn't gone. He had just found something worth fighting for. My edge, Elias, is that I no longer have anything to prove to you, but I have everything to prove to a little girl who thinks I'm a hero. If you want my seat, take it. But remember, I own 51% of the voting shares, so either sit down and listen to the new direction of this company or clear out your desk by noon. The room went silent. The coup was over before it had even begun. The annual Vance Global Charity Gala was the most prestigious event on the city's social calendar. Usually, Arthur attended for exactly 45 minutes, shook the necessary hands with a grip like ice, and vanished before the first course was served. But this year was different. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a sea of black ties and silk gowns, yet all eyes were on the grand staircase. Arthur appeared, looking every bit the Titan in a bespoke tuxedo. But beside him stood Sarah. She wore a deep emerald gown that complemented the spark of newfound confidence in her eyes. She wasn't the trembling woman from the sidewalk anymore. She was the architect of Arthur's peace. Behind them, Lily skipped down the steps in a white lace dress, her dinosaur backpack replaced for the evening by a small, glittery purse, though Arthur knew for a fact there was a plastic stegosaurus hidden inside it. The socialites whispered, their fans fluttering like the wings of nervous birds. "Is that the house manager? I heard she was a laundress." Arthur ignored the murmurs. He led Sarah to the center of the dance floor. As the orchestra began a soft waltz, he placed his hand on her waist. "They're staring," Sarah whispered, her cheeks flushing. "Let them," Arthur replied, his voice a low rumble of protection. "They're staring because they've never seen a man find his way home before." For the first time in his life, Arthur didn't look at his watch. He danced until the candles burned low, realizing that the most valuable asset he had ever acquired was the woman in his arms. To celebrate the end of the school year and the victory over the board, Arthur decided they needed to leave the glass and steel behind. He drove them himself to a sprawling estate he owned in the countryside, a place he hadn't visited in a decade. The house was surrounded by rolling hills and ancient oak trees, far from the reach of cell service and corporate anxiety. The transition was jarring, but beautiful. Without the city's hum, the silence was filled with the sounds of nature. Arthur traded his Italian leather shoes for sturdy boots. He spent the afternoon in a wide-open meadow, struggling to help Lily fly a massive kite shaped like a dragon. "Run faster, Mr. Arthur! The dragon is hungry for wind!" Lily shouted, her laughter carried away by the breeze. The Sarah sat on a picnic blanket nearby, watching the most feared man in finance sprint across the grass, his tie loosened and his hair tossed by the wind. She saw him stumble, laugh, and catch Lily in a bear hug when the kite finally soared into the blue. In the city, Arthur was a monument. Here, he was a man. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of violet and gold, Arthur sat down beside Sarah. He felt the grass beneath him and the warmth of the sun on his face, and he realized that for the first time in 45 years, he wasn't running toward a goal. He was exactly where he wanted to stay. That evening, as fireflies began to blink in the tall grass, they sat on the porch of the farmhouse. Lily was tucked between them, her head resting on Arthur's shoulder, her breathing heavy with the onset of sleep. The air was cool, smelling of pine and wild clover. "Mr. Arthur," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes, Lily?" "When I ran away, I thought my mommy didn't want me because of the juice. But you found me, and then you brought us to the big house, and you fixed the mean papers. Does that mean you're part of our story forever?" Arthur felt a lump form in his throat, a sensation he hadn't experienced since he was a boy. He looked at Sarah, whose eyes were shimmering with unshed tears in the moonlight. He realized that forever was a word he had only used in contracts, but now it felt like a sacred promise. "Lily," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion, "stories have many chapters. Some are sad and some are scary, but the best stories are the ones where people choose to stay together, even when it's hard. I would very much like to be in every chapter you have left. Lily looked up at him, her innocence cutting through his last remaining defenses. Are you going to be my daddy now? Like, for real? The question was a bridge between his old life and a future he hadn't dared to dream of. Arthur squeezed her hand, then reached out to take Sarah's. If your mommy says yes, he whispered, nothing would make me prouder. The proposal didn't happen at a five-star restaurant or on a private jet. It happened the next morning in the farmhouse kitchen. The floorboards creaked, and the air was thick with the scent of burnt toast, Arthur's first attempt at making breakfast for them. Sarah found him standing by the stove, looking frustrated by a smoking toaster. She started to laugh, a bright melodic sound that filled the room. Arthur turned, the smoke billowing behind him, and he didn't see a failure. He saw the only person who truly knew him. He wiped a smudge of soot from his forehead and took her hands. Sarah, he began, his voice dropping the CEO cadence entirely. I spent my life building walls because I thought being alone was the only way to be safe. I thought people were variables that couldn't be controlled. I was wrong. You and Lily, you're the only things that make sense to me. He didn't have a ring on him, he hadn't planned this, but he took a simple silver band from his own pinky finger, a ring that belonged to his father, the only thing he had kept from his past. I don't want a house manager. I don't want an employee. I want a partner. I want to wake up to your laughter every morning. Sarah Jenkins, will you marry me and let me be a father to the girl who found me on a park bench? Sarah didn't hesitate. She stepped into his personal space, the space he used to guard so fiercely, and wrapped her arms around his neck. Yes, Arthur, 1,000 times yes. The news of Arthur Vance's engagement to a commoner sent shockwaves through the financial districts from New York to Tokyo. But Arthur didn't care about the headlines. He returned to the Vance Tower with a new mandate. He called a general assembly of all employees, from the janitorial staff to the senior VPs. Standing on the podium in the atrium, he looked like a man who had finally stepped out of the shadows. For years, this company has been a machine, but a machine has no soul. From this day forward, Vance Global will prioritize the people who keep it running. We are implementing a comprehensive family support program, universal childcare for our staff, and a foundation dedicated to housing security for single parents. Elias Thorne watched from the balcony, realizing his influence was dead. Arthur wasn't just a CEO anymore, he was a leader. He transformed his sterile office into a place where Sarah often sat to discuss community projects, and where Lily had a permanent drawing corner stocked with every glitter crayon imaginable. The glacial king had become the architect of hope. He realized that by using his power to protect others, he had finally found the security he had been searching for his entire life. The wedding was held in the same park where Arthur and Lily had first met. It wasn't a gated private affair. Arthur had invited the whole neighborhood. The bench where they had discussed blue juice was draped in white flowers. Sarah walked down the aisle, her beauty radiant and real, while Lily, now officially Lily Vance, preceded her, throwing flower petals with the same fierce determination she had used to run away. As Arthur stood at the altar, he looked at his hands. They were no longer just tools for signing contracts. They were hands that knew how to hold a child and comfort a wife. When the minister pronounced them a family, the park erupted in cheers. Years later, the penthouse was no longer silent. It was a place of messy toy bins, the smell of home-cooked meals, and the constant, beautiful interruption of family life. Arthur often returned to that park bench when he needed to remember who he was. One evening, sitting there with Sarah as they watched an older Lily play in the distance, Arthur squeezed his wife's hand. "Are you thinking about the merger?" Sarah teased, leaning her head on his shoulder. "No," Arthur replied, looking at the sunset over the city he had once tried to conquer. I'm thinking about how lucky I am that a little girl with a dinosaur backpack thought I looked like I was hiding. I'm not hiding anymore, Sarah. I'm finally home. The camera pans up to the city skyline, where the Vance Tower glows, no longer a cold fortress, but a lighthouse in the dark. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and hit the subscribe button for more stories that inspire, teach, and entertain. Until next time, bye-bye.